It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of Blackwood. The wind was howling, and the rain was pouring down in sheets. Everyone was inside their homes, hoping to ride out the storm. But there was one person who was out and about, and his name was John. John was a private detective who had been hired to investigate a series of mysterious murders that had been happening in the town over the past few months. He had been working on the case for weeks, and he was getting close to finding the killer. But he needed one more piece of evidence to crack the case wide open. John was driving down Main Street when he saw a figure in the distance. It was a man walking down the street in the pouring rain. John couldn't see his face, but something about the way he moved made him uneasy. John decided to follow the man, just in case he was the killer he had been looking for. The man led John to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house was dark and foreboding, and John could hear strange noises coming from inside. He cautiously approached the house, his hand on his gun. As he entered the house, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around, gun drawn, but there was no one there. John shrugged it off and continued into the house, his heart racing. The house was old and decrepit, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards. John cautiously made his way through the house, searching for any clues that could lead him to the killer. As he entered the living room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, was the body of a young woman. She had been brutally murdered, her throat slashed and her body left to rot. John knew he had to call the police, but something told him to stay a little longer. He searched the room, looking for any clues that could lead him to the killer. That's when he saw it. There, on the wall, was a strange symbol carved into the wood. It was a circle with a cross in the middle, surrounded by strange writing that John couldn't understand. Suddenly, John heard a noise behind him. He spun around, gun drawn, but there was no one there. He shrugged it off and continued his search. As he made his way up the stairs, he heard a strange chanting coming from one of the rooms. He cautiously opened the door and saw a group of people gathered around a strange altar. They were chanting in a language John had never heard before, and in the center of the altar was a strange black book. Suddenly, one of the people noticed John and pointed at him, shouting something in the strange language. John knew he had to get out of there, but before he could make his escape, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. When John woke up, he was tied to the altar, surrounded by the strange cultists. They were chanting again, louder and more urgently than before. John struggled to break free, but the ropes were too tight. That's when he saw the killer. He was standing at the back of the room, holding a knife in his hand. John knew he was in serious trouble. The killer approached the altar, his eyes fixed on John. He raised the knife, and John braced himself for the end. But just as the killer was about to strike, there was a blinding flash of light. The room was filled with a bright white light, and the cultists screamed and scattered. When the light faded, John was alone in the room. The cultists had disappeared, and the killer was nowhere to be seen. John managed to free himself from the ropes and stumbled out of the house, his head spinning from the events that had just unfolded. He made his way back to his car and drove straight to the police station to report what he had seen. The police were skeptical of John's story at first, but when they investigated the abandoned house, they found evidence of the cult and the murder that had taken place there. They even found the black book that the cultists had been chanting over, and it was filled with dark and disturbing rituals. John's testimony helped the police to solve the case and bring the cult and their leader to justice. But even after the case was closed, John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He began to have nightmares about the cult and their strange rituals, and he became obsessed with finding out more about them. He dug deeper into the history of the town and discovered that the cult had been active there for centuries, and that they were responsible for many more murders and disappearances than anyone had ever realized. As John delved deeper into the cult's dark history, he began to uncover more and more disturbing secrets. He found evidence of human sacrifice, black magic, and even demonic possession. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that he was in danger. The cult was still active, and they knew that he was getting too close to the truth. John received threatening letters and phone calls, warning him to back off before it was too late. But John refused to give up. He was determined to bring the cult to justice and put an end to their reign of terror once and for all. He continued to investigate, even as the threats against him grew more and more serious. Finally, one night, John received a call from an anonymous source, telling him to meet them at the abandoned house where he had first discovered the cult. John knew it was a trap, but he couldn't resist the chance to finally confront the cult and their leader. When he arrived at the house, he found the cult waiting for him. They had set up a strange altar in the middle of the room, and their leader stood at the center, holding the same knife that he had used to murder the young woman. John knew he was in serious danger, but he refused to back down. He drew his gun and pointed it at the cult leader, demanding that he surrender. But the cult leader just laughed, and with a wave of his hand, he summoned a powerful demon to do his bidding. The demon was massive, with leathery wings and razor-sharp claws, and it towered over John, ready to strike. John knew he was no match for the demon, but he refused to give up. He stood his ground and fired his gun, hoping to buy himself enough time to find a way out. In the chaos that followed, John managed to escape the house and call for backup. The police arrived just in time to stop the cult and banish the demon back to the underworld. With the cult and their leader finally brought to justice, John was hailed as a hero in the town of Blackwood. But he knew that the nightmare was far from over. The cult's legacy would live on, and there would always be more dark and twisted secrets to uncover. But for now, John was just grateful to be alive, and he promised himself that he would never stop fighting to protect the innocent and uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous the journey might be.